Number 5. Braemar's Tight Squeeze. A second passage of Greece's 4-mile-long Corinth Canal is being planned by Fred Olsen Cruise Lines to promote more trips in the UK. Passengers will experience a once-in-a-lifetime adventure as the largest ship to ever travel across the 130-year-old canal with just 2.5 feet of clearance at the passage's narrowest points. The Braemar cruise ship made history in 2019. The cruise line intends to recreate the record-breaking navigation so travelers can relive history. The journey is planned for May 14, 2023. The TENS trip, which would require at least 2 years to organize, was first scheduled for April 2023. The ship got tugboat assistance to help it avoid any bumps in 2019. With such a tight squeeze, onboard passengers were sometimes even able to touch the canal's walls. The 642-long-foot Bremer exceeds the typical size of ships allowed to travel through the ancient waterway, even though boats have been passing through since 1893. Typically, the authorities only allow access to ships with beams shorter than 58 feet. Braemar making it through the canal by a hair is certainly impressive. But some canals and ships aren't as lucky. On March 13, 2022, the Ever Forward, which spanned the lengths of 3 football fields, was on its way to Norfolk, Virginia from the port of Baltimore when it got stuck in the Chesapeake Bay. It settled in for well over a month despite many rescue attempts. The tanker was filled with roughly 5,000 containers, and salvage experts assessed that they wouldn't be able to withstand its ground force. The first try at rescuing the ship was made when workers tried pushing it away from the sandbank and into deeper water. They used 5 tugs and 2 moored pulling barges. The tugs tried moving the ship's port, starboard, and while the barges linked to Ever Forward's back, acted as an anchor. That didn't work though. A week later, they tried again. This time they lightened the burden on the Ever Forward by removing some of the containers on board. After removing about 500 containers, crew pulled the tugboats once more. The Ever Forward was finally released with the help of 5 tugboats and 2 large barges. According to officials, there have been no complaints of injuries, property damage, pollution, and the original cause of the Ever Forward running aground is unknown. For 5 weeks it was trapped in the mud. Since it was outside the shipping canal, marine traffic was not completely interrupted. The same thing cannot be said for the Evergreen, the Ever Forward's sister. The Evergreen's grounding in the Suez Canal in 2021 attracted attention from all over the world. It was an expensive accident that stopped ship travel for a week and shut down a majority of the global supply chain. Number 4. Tesla Dad. At the beginning of 2023, a Tesla drove off Devil's Slide, a dangerous cliff in Northern California. Before plunging to the rocks below, it flipped a few times and ultimately landed upright. It barely missed the Pacific Ocean. The occupants of the car, a married couple and their 2 small children, miraculously survived the 300-foot fall. Despite their survival, the parents needed to be hospitalized and get treated for their injuries, though they weren't life-threatening. Children weren't even harmed. Police and multiple emergency response teams, as well as a helicopter, helped with the rescue. In most survival situations, people would say the survivors are lucky. But what if the accident could have been avoided altogether in the first place? Not long after the fall, neighbors, family, and friends learned the truth behind the family's accident. The California Highway Patrol claims that the wreck was intentional. A husband and father, Dharmesh A. Patel, was placed under arrest while at the hospital. He's now under suspicion for child abuse and several attempted murders. It wasn't reported what led authorities to come to this conclusion, but they guaranteed the decision was justified. By law, arrested patients remain in the hospital until their medical release. At that point, they're charged and sent to jail to either await trial or get bail set. Patel's hospitalization buys the DA's office more than enough time to review police reports, which will determine whether or not Patel will be charged as a criminal. As of January 9, 2023, Patel remained at the hospital under 24-hour close supervision. People who know the family were shocked to hear of the intentional wreck. Patel, a radiologist in California, was the picture-perfect family man, doting, good to neighbors, friends, and family, and even a respected doctor. A neighbor described the Patels as the nuclear family. A motive has not been released, which leaves everyone wondering, why would a man with such a picture-perfect life drive over a cliff with his family inside? What was going on behind the scenes? Number 3. Elon Musk's $1 million McLaren. By now, everyone has heard of Elon Musk. He's a man ahead of his time, with a remarkable track record thanks to his genius inventions. With projects such as Tesla, SpaceX, and Hyperloop, there's no doubt that Musk likes things that are efficient and fast. After receiving a degree in physics and science at the University of Pennsylvania, he continued his study at Stanford, but he dropped out to start a software company with his brother. In 1999, they sold the business to Compaq for $300 million. Musk then turned around and immediately purchased a $1 million McLaren F1. For the next year or so, he used it every day and racked up over 11,000 miles. In 2000, Musk was driving to a meeting in Palo Alto, California with his friend Peter Thiel. Elon himself admitted that he didn't know what he was doing when it came to driving the speedy car. Despite that, he wanted to show off after Thiel asked what the car could do. With a cheeky grin, Musk said, "Watch this." Elon then slammed his foot down. As they were going down the road at incredibly high and illegal speeds, Musk tried to switch lanes. The McLaren had no traction control though, which caused the rear wheels to fly off, sending his car into an uncontrolled spin. The $1 million vehicle went soaring into the air before slamming nose first into an embankment. Interestingly, the car landed in the same position it was before the crash, except it had some minor physical differences. The suspension on the car was totally wrecked. The windshield was smashed to bits, and the wheels were nowhere in sight. On the bright side, the wreck was no match for the mega-rich billionaire. After stopping, Musk just started laughing and said to Thiel, "Wow, Peter, that was really intense." As he was calming down, he explained to Thiel that he'd never insured the McLaren. Musk confirmed in their interviews that he didn't have auto insurance, but never said why. Most think it's because anyone wealthy enough to buy a $1 million car in cash can more likely than afford to pay out of pocket for repairs if needed. Not wanting to be late for the fundraising meeting they were supposed to attend, Musk and Thiel simply stuck out their thumbs and hitched a ride. Amazingly, he was able to get the vehicle repaired, but he later sold it in 2007 because he had an image to uphold as the CEO of multiple companies and didn't want people writing about him having a high-performance sports car. Would you get car insurance as a billionaire? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe while you're down there. Number 2. Deliberate train wrecks. Usually when we think of cars crashing into each other, monster trucks or demolition derbies come to mind. But people from the late 19th and early 20th centuries had something completely different planned. Starting in 1896, crowds developed the strange yet beloved hobby of watching staged train wrecks. And these bizarre events lasted for over 40 years. William George Crush was the mastermind behind the event called Crash at Crush. He was an employee at the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad, or Katy Railroad for short, a company that was financially suffering as a result of the Panic of 1893. He was handed the responsibility of finding ways to lure new customers to the railroad tracks. To get things going for the event, William created his temporary namesake town, Crush. He expected about 20,000 people or so to show up by traveling on the Katy Railroad. To support that many people, he drilled water wells, built a makeshift restaurant, and even made sure to include a wooden jail in case anyone got out of line. But to his shock, almost 40,000 attendees came to watch the crash. By 5:10 p.m. on the day of the first event, Crash at Crush was underway. After getting the signal, an engineer in each train pulled the throttles back as far as they could possibly go, which got the trains up to full speed. Then, they jumped off the locomotives just in time to avoid the collision. Guests were on the edge of their seats as they witnessed the two old steam trains barreling towards each other on the same track at 50 miles an hour. Crush wasn't prepared for the aftermath of the wreck. Upon impact, both boilers exploded, which sent wreckage flying everywhere. Many people were injured by stray metal shards. One person even lost an eye. The results of the crash didn't seem to faze the guests, though. When the show was over, the wreckage was combed through by visitors hoping to go home with a lucky souvenir. Crush was fired from the railroad company after the crash since it cost 2 people their lives. But after learning how successful the event was, Katy Railroad rehired him the next day. From there, a man turned staging train collisions into a lifelong career. Between 1896 and 1932, Joe Connolly, or Head-On Joe, staged over 70 wrecks. That's 146 destroyed trains. His shows were put on all throughout the country. He went from Boston to LA and from Tampa to Salt Lake City, Utah. He was known for really putting on a show. One of his specialties was attaching dynamite to the front of the trains and putting gasoline in the freight cars behind the engines. This caused vehicles to erupt into flames after the derailment. Painting the names of political candidates on the side of the trains in order for passengers to cheer on their preferred locomotive was another strategy for attracting bigger crowds. The Hoover versus Roosevelt was one example of a popular crash in 1932. The attraction surrounding the crashes declined by the 1930s. It was the height of the Great Depression, a terrible time to be wasteful and destroy trains, especially since they were still functional, just old. In 1932, Connolly performed his last crash at the Iowa State Fair. He reportedly remarked, "Well, that's that," and left after the damaging but spectacular performance. And at number 1, Arctic crash. Sergei Anailov, a Russian helicopter pilot, was almost the first person to fly around the world using a helicopter weighing less than 2,204 pounds. As day 42 of his trip approached, he only had 4,000 miles left to go. Sadly, his trip was cut short after one of the belts in his engine snapped and sent his helicopter plummeting into the Davis Strait between Greenland and Nunavut. During the descent, his blades were still spinning. Within 30 seconds, Sergei's chopper was at the bottom of the strait. His satellite phone, a distress beacon, and all his trackers were with it. Albeit soaking wet, he had a survival suit that he'd only worn from his bottom half, a life raft, 3 flares, and a small stash of protein bars. For the next 2 days, he clung to a 65-foot chunk of ice, fighting for his life. Anailov stayed under his life raft for the rest of the day. Within a few hours, he heard heavy breathing. As he looked up, a polar bear had walked right to him from across the ice. Angry at the situation he was in, the man jumped up and started roaring at the bear, waving his arms around wildly. He was certain that the bear wanted to eat him, and this would be his last moments in life. The bear turned and walked away, but wanted to make a lasting point. Sergei chased the creature all the way to the edge of the block of ice, and he didn't stop until he lost sight of it. The next morning, 2 planes flew past. They were oblivious to the flares Sergei launched because of the dense fog. He received visits from 2 other polar bears in the meantime. He stated that he could tell they were 3 different bears by the way they responded to him. Sergei reasoned that if the visits were from the same animal, it would have grown less frightened and more persistent each time. Later that evening, his encounter with polar bears came to an end. Thanks to the fog clearing up, an icebreaker crew saw the last flare Sergei fired. He was unharmed and able to reconnect with his family and friends despite the accident and 32 hours that followed. While he acknowledged that it could be difficult to win his family over, he expressed a desire to continue pursuing his goal and try to make it around the world again. He said in an interview, "But on my knees I must beg them to let me do it again and again."
6. Red Army Tank KV-1. From the murky bottom of a riverbank, an old Soviet tank that used to protect Leningrad from Nazis has been exhumed. During the 872-day siege that started in September 1941, the KV-1 tank drowned in the Neva River near Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. In the middle of November 2011, a group of troops used a floating crane to remove the massive tank from the water. It was discovered earlier that year in May and is currently on display at the Museum of the Battle for Leningrad. Experts believe that after spending decades underground, the tank can be restored to its former glory. The inability of the German Army Group North to take Leningrad resulted in the Leningrad blockade, or the Siege of Leningrad. On top of being one of the most deadly sieges in terms of casualties, it was also the bloodiest, longest, and most devastating in history. The KV-1 tank was notable for its powerful armor and attachments. It was named after the Soviet People's Commissar of Defense, Klement Voroshilov. The tanks could withstand hostile forces for days and were essentially impervious to enemy attacks. The tank sank with rounds still on board, but they were quickly removed to avoid danger. Thankfully, the ammo was not active, according to Andrei Bobrun, chief of the press department for the Western Military District. According to Mr. Bobrun, the fact that no crew members' remains were discovered inside the tank shows that they managed to escape the sinking war vehicle with their lives. 5. 28,000 duckies. In 1992, a cargo ship was headed to Seattle after leaving China. Naturally, it ran into some bad weather. Unfortunately, a shipping container fell off of the ship and landed in the water below. The ocean now had over 28,000 plastic toy ducks inside it. The toys were originally meant for First Years Inc., a company in the United States. The ducks would soon start traveling all over the world, and once people began noticing them, the incident turned into hot news. Their innocent appearance earned the little ducks the nickname Friendly Floaties. Despite originally falling into the North Pacific Ocean, the ducks were able to travel across the planet. As one might imagine, some popped up in the Pacific and washed up on the coasts of Hawaii, but they were also found much further away. About 15 years after they first dropped into the ocean, they made their way through Newfoundland and into the Atlantic Ocean, where they were able to pass through Arctic ice. Many got stuck in the process. Eventually, a few ducks landed in the United Kingdom. Other than cheering up anyone who sees them in the water, the friendly floaties have helped serve another purpose. In order to map currents, oceanographers have utilized their voyages over the world seas. Scientists have learned how huge ocean currents are and precisely how long it takes for them to complete a circuit by tracing the ducks accurately from their starting location. The book, Moby Duck, The True Story of 28,800 Bath Toys Lost at Sea, was not exactly what author Donovan Hahn had in mind when he started his investigation into the disaster. He quickly recognized, though, that he was becoming fixated on the story and grew eager to learn every little detail. In order to find out more about the floating ducks, he had to leave his full-time job and his wife behind. He also had to start on an international journey with a variety of boats and a number of different organizations. Given that a large number of the ducks were never rediscovered, they now serve as collectibles. Many of the toys were either submerged in the water or got stuck in the polar ice, stopping them from reaching the beach where they could be picked up easily. The American toy distributor responded by offering $100 for each duck, despite the fact that open market sales of the toys have exceeded $1,000. On large transport vessels, shipping containers frequently fall overboard. The World Shipping Council conducted a survey in 2014 and realized that at least 2,683 containers are lost at sea annually. Since many of the missing containers aren't reported to the authorities, they think the real number could be considerably higher. As they're frequently made of plastic and are buoyant enough to float, toys are one of the most common objects found washing up on coasts. A similar incident happened in 1997, when a shipment containing over 1 million Lego pieces was lost. There are also stories of beachgoers finding massive quantities of computer equipment, car tires, and even Nike sneakers. It gets stranger too. Robotic hands and prosthetic teeth have been seen. Items lost at sea often float for years on end in open waters. The ducks still periodically wash up on coasts 25 years after the incident, and many other items have been submerged in the ocean for decades before washing up on shore. When a group of fishermen hauled a message in a bottle out of the water in 2014, they found a postcard dated 1913 inside, indicating that it had been in the water for nearly 101 years. 4. Sea pigs. The sea pig is an alien-like animal that lives on the bottom of the ocean in the deepest, darkest parts. The sea pig's pinkish body and plump form certainly resemble its namesake, despite the fact that it's not related to land pigs in the slightest. They are known for spending their lives in the dark looking for their favorite type of food, dead animals. They may have an adorable and charming look, but the living vacuum cleaners are somewhat threatening thanks to their poisonous skin, which is their greatest defense against predators. Sea pigs are actually considered sea cucumbers, and they breathe out of their rear, which is sometimes used as a second mouth in certain species. It doesn't stop there though. The sea pig's upper sets of antennae are actually feet. It's pretty hard to transport these creatures to the surface for research, since they're commonly found 4,000 to 16,000 feet below the ocean's surface. Johan Halmar Thiel, a Swedish biologist who traversed the world from 1872 to 1876, first discovered sea pigs, one of these 65 new species he wrote about in his journals. 6 species make up the Scotoplanes genus, which has received minimal attention in research. The multi-legged sea cucumbers devour every bit of dead material they can find on the ocean for food. The sea pig has tube feet, which are extended appendages that allow movement, while other sea cucumbers are essentially large flesh tubes. There's a water vascular system that those tube feet are attached to. In essence, this means that they move under hydraulic pressure and hold a sizable amount of water. The sea pig's feet, which resemble antenna-like tubes on top of the animal, did not originally develop to help with movement. They instead provide the animal with the ability to decide what is and isn't edible. When food is abundant, sea pigs also congregate in groups, according to David Pawson of the National Museum of Natural History. To collect their food, sea pigs simply wait for marine snow or aquatic life above them that's died and sunk to the bottom. They utilize their antennas to find corpses once they've settled. The number of tentacles surrounding the mouths of these strange water monsters varies depending on the species. The animal moves by planting the smaller structures of each of those finger-like appendages in the mud in front of them. Sea pigs are constantly swimming against the current to collect food. Most of the time, the creature's diet consists of a variety of microorganisms. We only have a basic understanding of sea pigs since they're venomous, devour the dead, and live in the dark until they die, because our worlds are so far apart and almost never collide. For instance, we don't know if they'll live for another 10 years or 100. We'll have to wait and see. Have you ever heard about sea pigs? Let us know in the comments down below, and subscribe to the channel if you like the video so far. 3. Vacation house. In the winter of 1977, the 4-mile route between Bayside, Wisconsin and Madeline Island in Lake Superior was frozen, but maybe not solid enough for a house to move across. In Minneapolis, Lyle Wright from Dale Movers was certain the ice was sturdy. In order to get the home from the mainland to the island, he had an ice road specifically plowed. The 4-mile journey began on March 2, 1978. For the first few miles, it went well. The trailer towing the house's tires finally pierced through the ice at the 3-mile point. While the truck was still in drive, Lyle and his passenger, who'd been cautiously keeping their car doors open, jumped out. In a depth of 70 feet, the vehicle sank first, which was quickly followed by the house. The vehicle was raised to the surface after the owner was ordered by the Coast Guard to recover the debris the next summer. Although the home was secured with cables in the hope that it wouldn't fall apart, they were unable to elevate it. Instead, it split into several pieces and is still lying on the lake's bottom. 2. Ancient shark far from home. An ancient Greenland shark, a monster known for living in the freezing Arctic, was one of the last things experts thought they'd find in the warm Caribbean Sea. But scientists accidentally captured a Greenland shark, or maybe a Greenland shark hybrid, off the coast of Belize while trapping and tagging tiger sharks. Greenland sharks are a species able to survive for decades in deep water. The first thing the researchers speculated was that it was a 6-gill shark, a powerful and interesting deep-sea predator. But they documented the seldom-seen animal and determined that it was actually a Greenland shark. In fact, Greenland sharks are members of a family of sharks that have been present for 100 million years, dating back to the time the dinosaurs roamed the Earth. The sharks spend a majority of their lives below, in the darkness of the ocean, where they age, move, and develop. Moving slowly to preserve energy is a crucial adaptation in deep water where nutrients are few and far between. Because they can live for at least 2.5 centuries and maybe even longer, Greenland sharks are well suited for these conditions. They have the longest lifespan of any known vertebrate on the planet. There's no denying the fact that finding a Greenland shark off the coast of Belize near a coral reef was strange, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. In the deep waters around and in the Arctic, this relatively unknown species flourishes. According to researchers, they could also live in other parts of the deep ocean, even the Caribbean. When the researchers returned the next day after watching and researching tiger sharks, their line had drifted from the coral reef and into waters about 2,000 feet deep. At about 9,500 feet deep is where the slope of the neighboring reef ended. A Greenland shark might be able to thrive in this cold and gloomy environment. The finding of this Arctic shark serves as a reminder that just because we haven't seen something before doesn't mean it's not possible. Deep waters have a reputation for being poorly understood. 1. Message in a bottle. In February 1916, the German Zeppelin L-19, also known as LZ-54, just completed a bombing mission over the UK when it crashed into the North Sea on its way home. The 16-man crew of L-19 was found in the ocean by a British trawler named King Stephen. In the end, the crew all died. If one of the fallen crew members hadn't recorded the situation on a note he placed in a bottle and released into the water, the incident would have gone unreported. There were 2 notes in the container. February 2nd, approaching 1 p.m. will likely be our final hour. the Zeppelin's captain Otto Lowe wrote on the first piece of paper. The second, written by an unnamed crew member, included a description of the incident. "Greetings to my wife and child. An English trawler was nearby, but it refused to take us on board. She was King Stephen and hailed from Grimsby." 6 months later, the bottle washed onto Swedish beaches. The British media responded to Germany's propaganda exploitation of the memo by reporting that the captain of the King Stephen declined to assist the German crew out of concern that they would capture the ship. When he stated that the acts of the British crew were understandable, the Bishop of London threw fuel onto the flames. There was also a German newspaper that was less than impressed. They reported that the bishop acted less as an apostle of Christian charity than as a jingoistic hate-monger. A German U-boat sank the King Stephen before the bottle was first discovered. After being saved by the Germans, its crew was imprisoned until 1918, when they were released and sent back to Britain.
By the time the Titanic fell under his command, Captain Edward Smith was a seasoned mariner with over 40 years of seafaring experience under his belt. The so-called millionaire's captain was well liked, and he was especially popular among the rich and famous. Having captained large luxury liners in the past, he seemed like the natural choice to head the Titanic's maiden voyage. But when the ill-fated ship struck an iceberg in the frigid North Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest land, it was the first major maritime disaster Smith had ever encountered in his career. There are varying accounts of how he handled the ensuing chaos, with some claiming he did little to save lives, while others hailed him as a hero. In accordance with the long-held maritime tradition that a captain should be the last person to leave a sinking ship, Smith went down with the vessel. In the more than 110 years since, there have been countless reported sightings of his ghost. Some people even claim that they interacted with the deceased skipper. According to one account of an alleged encounter that happened in 1977, a ship called the SS Winterhaven was passing through the area where the Titanic sank when a passenger asked Second Officer Leonard Bishop for a tour of the ship. Something seemed eerily familiar yet out of place about the soft-spoken British gentleman, but Bishop couldn't figure out what it was. And unlike a typical passenger, he was extremely attentive to every detail of the ship. After finishing the tour, Bishop didn't see the man throughout the rest of the voyage. Years later, he happened to see a photo of Captain Smith and recognized him as the passenger he met on the Winterhaven, not realizing that it was the Titanic's captain. When he mentioned that he knew the man, someone told him it was impossible because Smith died in the sinking. Instead of assuming that he had met the captain's doppelganger while coincidentally sailing over the Titanic's watery grave, Bishop became convinced that he had interacted with Smith's ghost. The resemblance was too spot on for him to believe any other possible explanation. Numerous other vessels have also claimed to cross paths with Smith's ghost while passing through the region, while some others have reported seeing a ghost ship lurking in the waters where the Titanic sank. Reports describe glowing and flickering orbs in and around a passing vessel, along with radio interference and phantom SOS signals. Smith's ghost is also rumored to haunt his childhood home in the English city of Stoke-on-Trent. After buying the house as a rental property in 2002, Neil and Louise Bonner began hearing spooky stories from their tenants. One man told Neil Bonner that Smith's ghost had floated across his bedroom. Others reported feeling sudden chills pass through the room, which they described as being as cold as an iceberg. Renters also reported hearing banging, whispering, and other spooky noises. Luckily for the Bonners, nobody was compelled to move out because of the strange activity, and they had no trouble keeping renters in the house. One of the most compelling alleged sightings of Smith came 3 months after the Titanic sank, when a retired quartermaster named Peter Pryall insisted that he saw the captain on the streets of Baltimore. Pryall and Smith had worked together decades earlier, and Pryall said he recognized Smith instantly when he saw him. He tried talking to the man, who was wearing a light brown suit, a straw hat, and tan shoes while carrying 2 suitcases. During the first encounter, Smith didn't respond to Pryall. The next time they crossed paths, He confirmed his identity, but said he was on his way to Washington and cut the conversation short. The possibility that Smith had somehow survived the sinking and was living under an assumed identity was quickly ruled out. Some have written off the encounters as a case of mistaken identity, while others believe Pryl made up the story entirely. And a few have wondered if perhaps Pryl had a run-in with Smith's ghost, who certainly seems to get around for someone who's no longer living. Do you believe in ghosts? Tell us in the comments below and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Predictions and premonitions. In 1889, 14 years before the Titanic sank on its maiden voyage, an American author named Morgan Robertson wrote a fictional novel called Futility. The storyline features a ship bearing eerie similarities to the Titanic. Dubbed the Titan, the vessel in Robertson's story was almost the same size as the RMS Titanic. Measuring just under 800 feet long, it was around 80 feet shorter than the 883-foot-long real-life ship. Both ships were capable of traveling at impressive speeds of over 20 knots and had the bare minimum number of lifeboats that were legally required, despite carrying thousands of passengers. In his opening description of the Titan, Robertson described the ship in terms that were astonishingly similar to the newspaper articles that boasted about the Titanic. He touted the fictional vessel as unsinkable, only to strike an iceberg and sink during its maiden voyage. Just like the Titanic, the disaster happened in mid-April and most of the passengers died. The striking similarities have sparked widespread speculation among Titanic enthusiasts and scholars, as well as paranormal fanatics, that Robertson had some sort of premonition that predicted the sinking that came years later. And it's not hard to think that it's more than sheer coincidence, given the number of shared characteristics and the level of detail in which the ships resemble each other. But experts insist that Robertson was an ordinary human being with no precognitive abilities, and that there are perfectly logical explanations for the similarities. In an interview with the Associated Press, Titanic expert and scholar Paul Heyer pointed towards the author's background as a good place to look when it comes to ruling out the likelihood that psychic forces were at play. Robertson was both an experienced sailor and a seasoned writer who frequently wrote about maritime affairs and had a thorough understanding of shipbuilding trends. In other words, he had both the knowledge and the skill to come up with a detailed story that felt lifelike to the reader. According to Heyer, Robertson saw that ships were becoming very large and thought about the potentially disastrous effects of one hitting an iceberg. Not to mention, the Titan is not the main focus of the story, which is about a naval officer's journey to get his life back on track after the catastrophic sinking. The storyline focuses mainly on the main character's personal struggles, including alcoholism, his quest to win back the love of his life, and finding God. Even Robertson himself denied being psychic when people began latching on to the idea that he predicted the Titanic's sinking. He typically combated these claims by simply stating, "I know what I'm writing about, that's all." But there was no getting rid of the unwanted reputation which followed him around for the rest of his career. Another popular story about an alleged premonition about the disaster tells of a man named W. Rex Soden, who ran a Salvation Army orphanage in the Scottish town of Kirkcudbright. He was in bed on the night of April 14, 1912, when someone knocked on his door and told him that a sick kid at the orphanage named Jesse had taken a turn for the worse. The person at the door urged Soden to hurry over to the girl's bed. He got dressed and went to the child's room and sat by her bed, offering what little comfort he could provide. A little while later, Jessie sat straight up and asked him to hold her hand. She said she was so afraid and asked, "Can't you see that big ship sinking in the water?" Soden told the little girl that she was just having a bad dream, but he failed to ease her distress. In response to his attempts to calm her down, Jessie said, "No, the ship is sinking. Look at all those people who are drowning." And she mentioned a fiddle player named Wally. Convinced that Jessie was either dreaming, delirious from the severe fever she was suffering from, or both, Soden laid her back down in the bed. She lapsed into a coma and unfortunately lost her battle against her illness. Just a few hours later, news of the Titanic tragedy spread like wildfire around the world. When he learned that the ship's bandmaster, Wally Hartley, was among those who perished in the disaster, he immediately thought back to Jesse's strange statement about a fiddle player named Wally on a sinking ship. Soden had known Hartley as a child but was unaware until then that the musician was on the Titanic. The similarities between Jesse's final words and the wreck were too similar for him to simply write off as a coincidence. Reflecting on the experience years later, he reportedly said, "What I thought was hallucination was a vision that stamped itself indelibly on my brain and changed my whole spiritual outlook." Haunted artifacts. Many stories about Titanic-related hauntings revolve around the ship's artifacts, which seem to be a magnet for paranormal activity. One of the most famously haunted objects didn't come from the Titanic itself, but from the home of Captain Edward Smith. After the ship sank, the captain's maid, Ethelwyn, was allowed to choose one thing from his house to keep. She took a small mirror from Smith's dressing table. She claimed that every year on the anniversary of the sinking, his reflection appeared. The mirror was passed down through generations of Ethelwyn's family before being forgotten about for a period of time and rediscovered in a deceased descendant's estate. Since then, it's been passed through the hands of several collectors. While the story about the mirror is often told as fact, there's very little historical evidence to prove its provenance. The only document regarding its origins is a handwritten letter that was allegedly penned by Ethelwyn's sister-in-law, Hilda Goodman. Writing for the Skeptical Inquirer, enthusiast Kenny Biddle documented his exhausting attempts to definitively trace the mirror's roots to Edward Smith by comparing the information in the letter with official records. He didn't find any evidence ruling out the possibility that the mirror belonged to Smith. He uncovered several discrepancies, including the lack of any records that Hilda Goodman had a sister named Ethelwyn. A census record for Smith's household from 1911, the year before the Titanic sank, lists several domestic employees, but nobody named Ethelwyn. Record-keeping wasn't nearly as thorough or accurate back then as it is now, so it's quite possible that the story about the mirror's origins detailed in the handwritten letter is true, and it's commonly accepted as such. In early 2019, the mirror was sold at auction to its current owner, famed paranormal investigator and Paranormal Adventures host Zach Bagans. The artifact was expected to fetch more than $10,000, but it's unclear what Bagans paid. An entire collection of haunted relics can be found at the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, which is home to over 300 artifacts related to the disaster. Known by its straightforward name, Titanic, the Artifact Exhibition, the sprawling 25,000 square foot exhibit features luggage, china, pots and pans, first-class tiles from the ship's first-class smoking room, an unopened bottle of champagne, and more. It's also home to a 15-ton portion of the Titanic's hull, the largest piece of the ship ever recovered. Visitors and employees have reported feeling overcome by the feeling that they're being watched or followed and hearing strange noises, including disembodied voices and unexplainable footsteps. People have also reported being pushed, poked, and touched by an invisible presence and seeing apparitions throughout the hotel. Artifact expert Joe Zimmer reportedly claimed that the spirits tugged on his clothes and hair with alarming regularity, and he also got used to hearing someone whisper his name when nobody was around, along with phantom music. Included among the exhibit's resident spirits is the ghost of Frederick Fleet, the lookout who spotted the iceberg as the Titanic barreled toward it at full speed and warned the rest of the crew. Fleet survived the sinking, but was plagued by guilt for years afterward and tragically took his own life in 1964 after his wife passed away. He is not directly connected to any of the collection's artifacts, but many have claimed to see his ghost hanging out in the promenade deck section of the exhibition. There are also frequent reported sightings of a woman in a clearly outdated black dress with her hair in a bun. One morning, staff members discovered a photo of Bruce Ismay, the chairman and managing director of White Star Line, sitting on the floor where it was propped against a wall. Surveillance footage showed the picture shaking before moving down to the floor with what appeared to be the careful placement of invisible hands. The Titanic Aquatic Exhibit at the Georgia Aquarium in Atlanta is also famous for its intense paranormal activity. Much like the Luxor exhibition, people frequently report seeing ghosts, hearing old-fashioned music and strange noises, and being grabbed and tugged on by an unseen presence. Rumors claim that the ghost of an elderly woman dwells inside a replica of one of the Titanic's cabins. She surprises guests out of nowhere, only to vanish as quickly as she appeared. Thanks for watching. What do you make out of all these strange sightings and rumors of paranormal activity linked to the Titanic? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye for now.